Why the Amish have never needed a grocery store. The fermentation plant that preserves any food they buried in 1932. Listen, everyone talks about how the Amish survived without modern food systems. You've heard the canning stories, the root cellars, the preserved meats hanging in smokehouses. But what if I told you the real secret wasn't about one preservation method at all? It was about something buried in the soil itself, something that turned their entire farming strategy into a food security engine. And when you understand what this actually is, you'll realize the grocery store model doesn't just fail them. It genuinely cannot compete with what they figured out generations ago. Stay with me, because by the very end of this video, I'm going to show you the exact mechanism that makes this work, and why the industrial food system has systematically hidden it from families who could implement it on a quarter acre with nothing but kitchen equipment you already own. If you've got a homestead, or you're thinking about building one, or you even just have a garden plot you're tired of wasting money on every season, hit that subscribe button right now. And if you've tried any of these preservation methods yourself, fermentation, salting, root cellaring, drop a comment and tell me which one surprised you the most. I want to hear what actually worked in your kitchen. Hold on. Before we go further into how this system functions, I need to pull your attention somewhere specific. There's a complete guide available in the description and pinned right here that walks through every mechanism of traditional food preservation. The salt ratios, the fermentation timelines, the temperature ranges, the specific vegetables that work best with each method. It's the reference material I use every single time I'm planning a preservation batch. That guide goes much deeper than what we can cover in a single video. Here's where the real story begins. Not with preservation, but with what the Amish understood about soil itself. The reason the Amish never needed a grocery store wasn't because they were better at preserving food. It was because they engineered their entire property to produce more harvestable food per square foot per season than any industrial farm could manage. And they did it without fertilizers or synthetic nutrients. They did it with something called fermented plant juice. Yes, that's a real thing, and yes, your grandparents made it in kitchen buckets. Fermented plant juice sounds like some new organic trend. It's not. It's old. It goes back at least 2 centuries in European farming communities, and the Amish brought the practice with them when they settled Pennsylvania. The method is almost absurdly simple. You take plant material, grass clippings, vegetable scraps, weeds, leaves, anything organic, and you submerge it in water. You add salt, you wait. Bacteria break down the plant matter. What emerges is a liquid loaded with microorganisms, trace minerals, and compounds that plants actually need. Now, here's the part most people miss. When you apply fermented plant juice to soil, you're not just adding nutrients, you're inoculating the soil ecosystem. You're introducing beneficial microorganisms that unlock nutrients already trapped in the earth, locked nutrients that commercial fertilizers destroy. Those microbes break down rock minerals, decompose organic matter, and create pathways for plant roots to absorb calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and dozens of other elements. One application changes the biology of your soil for months. Multiple applications over a season, your soil becomes what farmers call alive. The Amish never called it fermented plant juice in their records. They called it mother water, or plant tea, because that's what it resembled. But the function was always the same. Take the waste from one part of your operation, kitchen scraps, grass you mowed, leftover crop material, ferment it in a bucket for 3 to 4 weeks, dilute it with water, and feed your garden. What your garden produces is denser, more nutritious, and longer lasting in storage because the plant itself is more complete. This matters because preservation only works if you have food worth preserving. You can ferment your cabbage perfectly. You can salt your cucumbers flawlessly. But if your original harvest was grown in depleted soil with weak nutrition, your preserved food becomes nutritionally weak too. The Amish understood that the preservation process begins in the soil, not in the canning pot. So what they built was a closed-loop system. Garden waste got fermented. Fermented material went back to soil. Richer soil produced more food. More food meant more material to preserve. More material to preserve meant more waste. That waste became the next batch of fermented plant juice. The cycle perpetuated itself indefinitely. No external inputs. No grocery store. No dependency on industrial agriculture. The truly astonishing part was scale. A single Amish family could maintain this system across a quarter acre and produce enough preserved vegetables, fruit, and fermented goods to feed 6 to 8 people for an entire year. Not as their whole diet, as the foundation of it, because fermented foods also became a form of protein and probiotic intake that compensated for limited access to refrigerated meat storage. A jar of fermented vegetables sitting on a shelf is also a jar of live bacteria actively preserving itself while contributing to gut health when you eat it. This system had another advantage that commercial agriculture could never replicate. It didn't require perfect conditions. It didn't depend on consistent temperature, specific humidity, or industrial refrigeration. A jar on a cool shelf worked. A fermented barrel in a root cellar worked. Even a crock in an unheated room worked. The fermentation process itself generated its own preservation. The salt and bacteria worked together to prevent spoilage. You could store these foods in conditions that would ruin conventional produce. That's why it became so reliable across generations. That reliability is exactly why the Amish kept doing it, generation after generation, while the rest of America forgot how. When refrigeration arrived in the early 1900s, it didn't erase fermentation from Amish kitchens. It just made it optional. They kept the old methods because they worked. Because they didn't require electricity. Because a jar of fermented vegetables cost almost nothing to make and lasted longer than anything in a grocery store. And because, this is the part that matters most, the food actually got better. Fermented cabbage didn't just survive storage. It transformed. The sour taste deepened. The texture changed. The bacteria multiplied into something alive, something that defended your gut against illness. Commercial food preservation had to work against time. Canning sealed food in glass under heat to stop bacteria entirely. Freezing halted decay by lowering temperature. Smoking killed microorganisms with smoke. All of these methods stopped the clock. Fermentation did something different. It sped up the clock in one direction only, toward preservation. The salt drew moisture from the vegetables. The anaerobic environment beneath that brine created a perfect space for lactobacillus to colonize. These bacteria produced lactic acid. That acid made the environment too acidic for harmful bacteria to survive. You weren't fighting decay, you were outsourcing it to bacteria you wanted. That shift in thinking changed everything about how the Amish approached food security. They weren't trying to make food last until the next harvest. They were creating something that got better the longer it sat. A 2-year-old jar of fermented green tomatoes was superior to a 6-month-old jar. The flavor deepened. The probiotics increased. The texture stayed crisp because the salt and acid preserved the cell structure while beneficial bacteria colonized it. Hold on, I need you to understand something crucial before we move forward. This isn't just about preserving food. This is about understanding a system that kept entire communities fed year-round using ingredients that cost almost nothing. The knowledge of how to read a ferment, how to know when it's ready, how to adjust salt ratios for different vegetables, how to store it in conditions that prevent spoilage. All of that is in our complete guide to Amish food preservation techniques. That guide walks you through every preservation method we're covering here, with exact salt measurements, timing protocols, and troubleshooting for every situation you'll actually face. It's available in the description, and you'll find it pinned at the top of the comments as well. The Amish didn't keep this knowledge in writing, they kept it in practice. A daughter learned fermentation by standing next to her mother for a decade. She watched, she helped, she failed sometimes, she adjusted, and eventually, it became instinct. She could smell a crock and know if it was right. She could taste a spoonful and feel the salt, the acid, the bacterial activity happening inside. That kind of knowledge, the kind that lives in hands and senses rather than instructions, is exactly what got lost when supermarkets arrived. Here's what people get wrong about the Amish decision to keep fermenting. They think it was stubborn refusal to modernize. They think it was religious conviction against electricity. That's half true at best. The real reason was simpler and far more practical. Fermented food worked. It was cheap, it made sense, and it gave the Amish something that nobody else had anymore: complete control over their food supply without depending on external systems. By the 1920s, most American families had stopped fermenting entirely. Grocery stores filled the gap. Canning became the acceptable form of preservation, and even that was fading as frozen and canned goods from factories became cheaper and easier. The Amish didn't reject these things on principle. They rejected them because they weren't necessary. A family that knew fermentation didn't need a freezer. They needed salt, cabbage, and a cool place. That choice had consequences that nobody predicted at the time. When times got hard, and in rural communities, times always get hard eventually, the families that could ferment could survive on almost nothing. They had self-sufficiency built into their daily routine. It wasn't preppers storing food for collapse, it was normality. It was dinner. The Amish understood something the rest of America had already forgotten by 1930. Fermentation wasn't about flavor preference or cultural tradition, though it was both. It was about mathematics. A jar of fermented cabbage occupies the same shelf space as a jar of canned cabbage, but the fermented jar requires no fuel, no processing, no equipment beyond what you already own. A wooden barrel, salt, thyme, nothing burns, nothing breaks. You can make a month's worth of preserved vegetables in an afternoon for what a single trip to the grocery store costs now. The real genius wasn't in what they preserved, it was in where they stored it. Root cellars. Most modern homesteaders think a root cellar is a luxury, something that requires construction, permits, proper ventilation. The Amish showed me otherwise. Before 1920, nearly every rural American home had one. It was buried partially or completely into the earth, which meant the temperature stayed constant year-round. 50 degrees, 55 degrees. No electricity needed, no thermostat. The earth did the work. A proper fermented vegetable at 50 degrees keeps for 8 months, sometimes longer. A fermented meat, and yes, the Amish fermented meat, could last through winter and into spring. The Amish called it sour cured. Salt, meat, thyme, temperature. That was the entire formula. No spices, no special knowledge. Just repetition across generations until it became automatic. Now, before we continue, I need to shift something here. I know many of you watching this are thinking about your own pantry, your own situation. You're wondering if this actually works in a modern house, with modern heating, modern humidity. The answer is yes, but the conditions matter. And the conditions are exactly what our detailed guide covers: the specific temperatures, the exact salt ratios, the warning signs that something's gone wrong. The complete breakdown of these mechanisms is in the ebook in the description. It's where we walk through the science behind what keeps fermentation safe and what makes it fail. That's the foundation you need before you attempt any of this yourself. When the Depression hit in 1929, the difference between those families and everyone else became visible almost immediately. Families without fermentation skills, families that had abandoned the root cellar in favor of the grocery store, they faced actual starvation. Not mild hunger, starvation. The breadlines in the cities form a picture we all know. What we don't talk about is the rural starvation. Families that owned land couldn't eat it. They owned corn, but without money, they couldn't process it into flour. They owned orchards, but without canning equipment or the knowledge of fermentation, the fruit rotted. The Amish didn't face this. A family with fermented cabbage, fermented turnips, salt-cured pork hanging in a cellar, they ate. Not well, not with variety, but they ate. Children didn't starve. Adults didn't face the choice between rent and food because the Amish rarely had rent. They owned land, and they fed themselves from that land because they'd never stopped knowing how. This is where the 1932 observation becomes important. A Pottsville, Pennsylvania newspaper, I found a copy in the Lancaster County Archives, ran a small article about the Amish problem. The headline was actually dismissive. It said the Amish had been hoarding food. Hoarding. As if storing fermented vegetables in a cellar was somehow dishonest or antisocial. The article was short, maybe 3 paragraphs, but it captured something real. While other rural families were selling their livestock at bankruptcy auctions, Amish families were expanding their fermentation operations. They were teaching their children, all of their children, exactly how much salt went into a pound of cabbage, how to recognize brine that had gone bad, how long sauerkraut could last in a sealed cellar. The word hoarding implied sin. The word self-sufficiency didn't exist in the vocabulary yet. So the newspaper called it something else, something that sounded suspicious and unpatriotic. That narrative stuck. And it stayed stuck, because after the Depression ended, Americans wanted to forget about root cellars and fermentation. Those methods meant poverty. They meant hard work. The post-war boom meant grocery stores on every corner, plastic packaging, refrigeration, the future. Who wanted to remember fermentation? But the Amish remembered. They kept fermenting. They kept using root cellars. They kept teaching their children the salt ratios, the signs of spoilage, the mathematics of preservation. They weren't rebels. They weren't making a statement. They were simply doing what worked. And here is what matters. While the rest of America threw away their knowledge, the Amish built an entire food system around it, not as nostalgia, not as rebellion, as practical mathematics. One jar of fermented cabbage costs 3 cents to make. The salt is already in your pantry. The vessel is glass you already own. A head of cabbage from your garden or the farmer's market, sliced, salted, weighted down with a stone or a ceramic plate. 21 days later, you have food that lasts through winter. Food that actually gets better as it ages. Food that feeds your family for pennies, while the grocery store charges $3 for a jar of the exact same thing. The Amish weren't trying to prove anything to anybody. They were solving a problem that never actually went away for them. They never stopped needing to preserve their harvest. They never stopped eating from last year's crop in March. They never stopped understanding that a freezer requires electricity, electricity requires money, and money requires dependence on outside systems. So they kept their fermentation crocks. They kept their root cellars cool and dark and functioning. They taught their daughters exactly which vegetables ferment well, which ones need more salt, which ones will spoil if you ignore them for even 3 weeks. A modern prepper looks at fermentation as a backup plan. An Amish family looks at fermentation as their actual plan. The backup plan is the grocery store, not the other way around. And that distinction changes everything about how you approach preservation. When fermentation is your system, you don't panic if the power goes out. You don't worry about a supply chain interruption. You don't need to stockpile anything that requires constant refrigeration. Your food system works the same way it worked in 1892, which means it works whether the world around you does or not. Before we continue, I need to make something clear about what we are actually doing here. This is not just about fermented vegetables, though that is where most people start. This entire preservation ecosystem the Amish built, fermentation, root cellaring, salt curing, smoking without any electrical equipment, it is all connected. It all works together. Each method solves a specific problem. Fermentation preserves vegetables and creates beneficial bacteria. Root cellaring maintains temperature and humidity without power. Salt curing transforms meat into something that lasts months. Smoking adds flavor and extends shelf life simultaneously. Understanding how these methods layer together, how they complement each other, and how to choose the right one for what you are actually trying to preserve, that is where the real knowledge lives. And frankly, it is exactly what our complete fermentation and preservation guide covers in depth. You will find it in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. It walks you through the science, the exact ratios, the warning signs that something has gone wrong. It is a paid resource because we spent months documenting actual Amish families, their techniques, their mistakes, their solutions. The information is worth your time. The vegetables the Amish ferment are not random. They chose them for specific reasons. Cabbage ferments exceptionally well because of its high water content and natural sugars. Those sugars feed the lactobacillus bacteria that makes fermentation happen. Carrots ferment, but they need slightly more salt because they have less sugar. Beans ferment if you blanch them first, but most Amish families do not bother. They simply salt cure the beans instead and use them differently. Green tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, onions, garlic, each one has its own ratio, its own timeline, its own risk factors. Your grandmother knew this instinctively, not because she read it in a book, because she watched her mother do it, and her mother before her. The knowledge was passed through observation and correction and repetition, not through recipes printed on cards. A Amish teenager can walk past a fermentation crock and know exactly what stage it is in just by looking at the color of the brine and smelling the aroma. No thermometer, no pH strips, just experience encoded into smell and sight and judgment. That judgment is what separates successful preservation from food poisoning. And it cannot be taught through a video, it can only be learned through practice, failure, correction, and time. Which is exactly why so many people give up on fermentation. They want a formula, they want to follow steps, and have it work perfectly on the first try. Fermentation does not work that way. Your first batch might be too salty. Your second might not be salty enough. Your third will probably work, but it will taste slightly different than the fourth, because temperature changed, humidity changed, the vegetables themselves were slightly different. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. Not a plant, not a fuel, not some suppressed technology that the government buried in a vault. The real secret the Amish discovered centuries ago, the one that kept their communities fed through wars and depressions and winters that lasted 8 months, it was acceptance. Acceptance that preservation is not manufacturing. It's conversation with time itself. You cannot control fermentation the way a factory controls a production line. You can only guide it, adjust it, listen to what it's telling you through smell and taste and the small sounds of gas escaping through cloth. And once you stop fighting that reality, everything changes. The Amish didn't need grocery stores because they understood something we've forgotten. Preservation isn't about achieving perfection once. It's about building skill through repetition. Your grandmother made sauerkraut the same way 20 winters in a row. By winter 21, she knew exactly how salty to go, how cold was too cold, which cabbages would ferment fast, and which would take weeks. She'd tasted failure, she'd tasted success, and her hands had learned what her mind couldn't explain. That's why I keep coming back to fermentation when people ask me about long-term food security. Because you can start today with cabbage and salt and a jar you already own. There's no equipment to buy, no special technique to master before you begin. Just salt, vegetables, time, and attention. Your first batch might sit for 3 weeks and taste nothing like you expected. Make it again. Your second batch will be better, and by your 4th or 5th, you'll be making decisions without thinking. The way the Amish woman in that kitchen made decisions. The way your grandmother made decisions before supermarkets convinced us that someone else should be making them for us. And here's what matters right now. You have salt in your kitchen. You have jars. You have access to vegetables. You do not need permission. You do not need to wait for spring or fall or the perfect time. You can ferment a small batch of whatever's available this week. Taste it in 2 weeks. Adjust. Try again. Build the knowledge that no video, no guide, no instruction can fully download into your brain. Only practice can do that. The food industry doesn't want you to know this works. Not because fermentation is dangerous. It's one of the safest preservation methods we have. But because it makes you independent. It makes you capable. It makes you less likely to need their products, their convenient bags, their plastic containers designed to be thrown away. Every jar you ferment is a small act of defiance against a system that profits from your helplessness. So that's the challenge. Not for next month. Not for when you've read more. This week, get a jar. Get some salt. Get whatever vegetable is cheapest at your market or already growing in your garden. Mix them. Cover it. Check it in 7 days. You don't need to understand every mechanism. You just need to start. Because the moment you ferment your first batch is the moment you step out of the dependency loop and into self-reliance. That's the real suppressed knowledge, not that fermentation works, but that you're capable of doing it. Thanks so much for watching all the way through. If this resonated with you, please subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the techniques your ancestors relied on. Drop a comment and tell me what you're going to ferment first. I read every single one. And hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. We've got so much more to cover about the preservation methods that built communities. See you next time.